This video is going to cover natural selection. Simply put, evolution is a change in gene frequencies in populations over time. Evolution is important for so many reasons, too many to say in just a short time, but it is the foundation from which all of biology can be understood. One early example of a theory of evolution was propositioned by Lamarck. His theory was that acquired characteristics were passed on to offspring, which you can see on the top half of the diagram. The giraffes start out with short necks, then after they stretch and stretch, their necks grow longer to reach the leaves. Then their offspring are born with long necks too. However, Lamarck was wrong. Part B shows Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection at work. Evolution works through several mechanisms. The first one is through genetic mutations, which are changes in DNA. This is the main source of actual variation in evolution. Genetic drift, gene flow, and natural selection all change the frequency of variation.
Natural selection is a non-random process by which certain traits become more or less prominent due to their favorability under specific environmental conditions. Individuals with better adapted traits have a greater chance of surviving and reproducing, allowing them to pass their genotypic characteristics to offspring, which can be summed up in the phrase reproduction of the fittest. An example of natural selection is the peppered moths. The peppered moth is found in light gray and dark gray. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the light gray version was more common because most trees were covered in light-colored lichen. After the Industrial Revolution, the burning of coal killed the lichens, making the bark darker and the light gray moths more visible and susceptible to predation. Thus, the light gray color became maladaptive. The peppered moths are also an example of directional selection, where one phenotype is favored over the other so the allele frequency shifts in one direction, as shown in the lower middle graph. The graph on the left represents stabilizing selection, which happens when extreme phenotypes are selected against and the average traits are favored. Conversely, disruptive selection, the graph on the right, is when extreme traits are favored so that the population is divided into two distinct groups and the mean is selected against.
There are 4 essential conditions for natural selection to occur. These conditions state that there must be a variation in reproductive success, a variation in traits among individuals, and that these variations correlate with fitness difference, and traits can be genetically passed on to offsprings. It's important to note that natural selection occurs in individuals, but individuals do not evolve, populations evolve. Hardy-Weinberg proposed an equation to calculate the genetic variation of a population. However, his equation only works when allele frequencies remain constant, meaning no evolution occurs in the population. For there to be no evolution, 5 conditions must be met. First, no random mating can occur. Second, no immigration between species. Third, no natural selection. 4, no mutation in genome. And 5, the species must have a large population size. There are 3 different types of speciations. Allopatric speciation happens when there is a physical barrier dividing a space. Parapatric speciation is where there is a hybrid zone. Sympatric speciation is when a new species occur within the same space. We hope this video has helped you understand natural selection and adequately prepare you for the final exam.
Hello, my name is Xuqing.
My name is Lynn.
My name is Anthony.
And this is our video for Lecture 5 on adaptation.
Enjoy!
In 1977, DSV Elvin, sponsored by NOAA, took an expedition down to the 70 to 100 feet deep ocean and discovered the hydrothermal vent. There was no oxygen or light. The water was highly acidic and extremely hot. The surrounding environment was full of hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and methane. However, hydrothermal vents have higher biomass and species abundance than the abyssal plain. To understand how they survive, we must learn the concept of fitness landscape. In the 2D version, where fitness is on a y-axis, species usually move from valleys to the peak of the mountains. Point A, B, D are local optimum, and point C is global optimum with the highest fitness. To make it clearer, take the example of the yeti crab. In the 3D version, the yeti crabs migrate through the landscapes with changing phenotypes and fitness. Eventually, they reach to a local optimum or obtain the optimal traits that allow them to gain foraging independence by farming chemosynthetic bacteria. One thing to keep in mind is that fitness will not change without mutation.
Adaptation can be best understood as a dynamic evolutionary process. This continuous process causes traits to develop as a response to imposed conditions and ultimately contributes to the fitness and survival of individual organisms. So, what are these traits? They're heritable, meaning they can be passed down from one generation to the next, and they have some functional role that is maintained and evolved by natural selection. They can be structural, behavioral, or physiological. But there's a catch. If a trait has no genetic variability, a response to selection is not possible. But there's still some good news. Rapid variability in the environment can select for what's known as phenotypic plasticity, basically one set of genes expressing different phenotypes depending on both abiotic and biotic factors. This variability, again internal to just one gene, can be expressed on a neat little graph as a reaction norm, also referred to as the norm of reaction, showing the range of phenotypes specific to just that gene. Changes in an individual's phenotype can either be reversible, like acclimation in the example of the sad, matted-looking Arctic fox in summer compared to the radiantly happy, truly regal Arctic fox in winter. Or they can be irreversible, like in the example of Daphnia developing helmets, making them permanently and irreversibly ready for battle, or football. So, the main takeaway point of adaptation is this: an organism's phenotype should be understood as the sum of its genotype and the environment it finds itself in.
The next thing we'll talk about is reciprocal transplant experiments. This is when scientists take organisms from different environments, then swap them out to figure out the cause of differences between populations. This can be due to genetic factors, environmental factors, or separately evolved reaction norms. Organisms can be categorized based on how they regulate body temperature. Homeotherms use metabolic energy to maintain a relatively constant body temperature, while poikilotherms are organisms whose body temperature varies directly with the environment. Homeotherms have a range of environmental temperatures over which the metabolic rate does not change. This is known as a thermal neutral zone, or TNZ. Outside of the TNZ, heat production and heat loss are not in equilibrium, and metabolic energy is spent returning the organism to its TNZ. Finally, all organisms have trade-offs in allocation of energy and resources to growth, reproduction, and survival. For example, a manatee's snout may be optimal for scouring the seafloor for food, but not so much for glass walls.
I think it's time for us to migrate south.
No, you stupid idiot. That's a suicide mission. You're trying to get us killed.
But the water is salty.
Yes, Brian is correct. We need to migrate as our water source has reached our halo tolerance. Basically, the water got too salty.
What? How?
You a fool. The water quality is bad. Look at all the animals that bathe in it. Also, low rainfall has led to evaporation. But we still have water to drink. Its quality is poor.
The decreased rainfall has led to more concentrated pollutants in the water. We're gonna die if we keep drinking this low-quality water.
Okay, let's migrate. Hoof sounds.
Why did we go on that journey? A third of us died.
Because we're osmoregulators.
What's an osmoregulator?
Our body's osmolarity is tightly regulated and constant despite environmental changes.
What the heck does that mean?
It means as osmoregulators, we develop psychological responses to balance our internal osmolarity, which require more energy for survival. Osmoconformers, on the other hand, matches their body's osmolarity with their surroundings.
What is an example of osmoconformers?
Fish! They regulate their ions by drinking water and using diffusion, active ion transport, and secretions to match the water they're in.
Fish are salt tolerant with physical and biochemical adaptations.
Ooh, like their salt secretion methods.
Yes, there's also salt avoidance.
How do you know so much?
I took Ecology 303 with Ro-Chan. She's the best professor in the world and deserves tenure.
Let me guess. Salt avoidance is an adaptation to avoid salt.
Yes, but there's much more to that. It involves minimizing or excluding cellular salt concentrations. Other forms of salt avoidance are isolation and secretion, as well as sequestration and sacrifice.
Oh, excretion, like poop, right?
Yes, different animals have different methods to secrete the excess ions in their bodies.
Oh, I remember, like fish secrete ammonia, birds secrete uric acid, and mammals secrete urea.
Yes, their urine secreted by mammals is hypertonic. This is a strategy of
osmoregulation. Wow, I'm learning. I love ecology.
Do you know the other types of osmolarity?
Yes, hypotonic, hypertonic, and isotonic.
Correct. You're catching on fast.
What about sequestration and sacrifice?
One example of that is when plants put all their salts in one leaf and cut off that leaf in order to get rid of excess salts.
But that's not the only plant that osmoregulates itself. Algae are such strong osmoregulators that they provide fresh water for marine iguanas.
Ah, I see. Each organism has a halotolerance threshold. Physiology is a driving factor for animal ecology.
Ah, here we are. The beautiful ocean in the Californian kelp beds.
What planet are we even on? Is it Mars again?
Dude, it's Earth. You know I'm a big fan of Earth's marine life. Look! You know that they hold hands so they don't lose each other?
Honestly, I hope they lose each other. They're just sitting eating urchins all day like bums.
Man, you don't even know. Otters are a keystone species. Other species in an ecosystem largely depend on them. If otters were to be removed, the ecosystem would change drastically. Take a look at this. This thing, if left unchecked, can ruin the entire ecosystem. It'll eat all the kelp, and without the kelp, the crabs will die. Without the crabs, the fish will die, and the food web will fall apart.
Hold up, the what?
The food web. You know how a food chain illustrates energy flow from one trophic level to another? A food web shows all the interactions between organisms in an ecosystem. Does that orca really have to eat that much?
He actually has to. Because of trophic inefficiency, that orca has to eat 10 calories of otter to gain 1 calorie of biomass. This is the rule of 10%, where only 10% of energy from one trophic level moves up because of factors like metabolism and energy waste. This energy loss restricts the length of food chains and the biomass of higher trophic levels. The orcas are only here because their other food sources are being taken. Isn't overfishing a big problem here on Earth? Humans are removing an entire trophic layer, fish. This results in the higher trophic levels, resorting to other means of sustenance. For these orcas, it looks like they're starting to eat sea otters as an alternative.
I suppose it is a problem. Alright, your turn. You pick where to go. Wow! Look around! This place is crawling with primary producers.
Excuse me?
Primary producers, otherwise known as autotrophs. There are different kinds of autotrophs, all of which produce biomass from inorganic compounds. Some make energy from sunlight. These are called photosynthetic autotrophs. They produce glucose and release O2 as a byproduct. Chemosynthetic autotrophs use inorganic materials such as hydrogen sulfide and CO2 and oxidize them, converting the inorganic compounds into organic compounds and producing energy and water. Finally, lithotropic autotrophs use inorganic minerals as carbon and energy sources. These microorganisms live in the ground and turn rocks into energy.
Who cares? Heterotrophs are the ones that eat autotrophs or other heterotrophs, and they break down the compounds that you just spent all that time talking about. All I know is that heterotrophs rule this planet, and the autotrophs just sit there and let themselves get eaten.
See, that's where you're wrong, kiddo. Many plants exhibit defenses against heterotrophs. A tree, for example, has different ratios of carbon to nitrogen in its different parts. A higher ratio is less nutritional, increasing its defense against hungry heterotrophs. A more extreme case would be harmful algal blooms, a phytochemical defense. Together, the autotrophs and heterotrophs make one large pyramid of biomass, where the primary producers form the base and the heterotrophs form the subsequent layers. Because each heterotrophic layer is 10 times smaller than the last, the pyramid looks more like a skyscraper.
Alright, if I wanted a lecture, I'd go to Boston University. Let's get out of here.
Optimal foraging theory. Optimal foraging theory is a model that helps predict animal feeding behavior as an optimizing process. Optimal foragers capture and consume food that provides them the greatest potential energy while expending the least amount of energy and time. There are two main types of foragers in optimal foraging theory, generalists and specialists. Generalists thrive in a variety of environments, and their diet consists of a wide range of items. It is better to be a generalist in an unproductive environment, meaning profitable prey is rare. In this case, generalists consume everything they come across in order to maximize the potential energy from prey. This is because the time it takes to capture, prepare, and eat prey is short relative to their search time. An example of generalists are raccoons. They tend to thrive in a variety of environments, including urban areas, and eat whatever they come across, whether that be trash, fish, vegetables, etc. Specialists thrive in very specific environments, and their diets are usually limited to one thing. It is better to be a specialist in very productive environments in which profitable prey is common. Search time in this case is short relative to the time it takes to capture, prepare, and eat prey. Specialists have narrow diet breadths and thrive in specific environments. An example of a specialist are koalas. Koalas are one of 3 mammals that eat eucalyptus leaves. Their digestive system is specifically adapted to handle the poisonous toxins in eucalyptus leaves. Koalas only thrive in place of the eucalyptus because that is all they eat. Predator functional responses. In a functional response, if you gradually increase the amount of food available to a hungry animal, its rate of feeding will increase and then level off at a maximum feeding rate. There are 3 patterns of functional responses. In a type 1 response, feeding rate increases linearly as food density increases, then levels off abruptly at a maximum feeding rate. Filter feeders are the most common animal that have a type 1 response. In a type 2 response, feeding rate first rises linearly, slowed by food search. At intermediate densities, predation rate slows with handling time. At high densities, predation rate levels off at maximum feeding rate. The type 2 functional response is the most common functional predation response seen in nature. In a type 3 response, feeding rate is slow at low densities due to a learning curve. Once the animal becomes familiar with its prey in intermediate densities, feeding rate rises steeply and then levels off at a maximum feeding rate. Deer mice feeding on sawflies are an example of a type 3 predator functional response. Marginal value theorem. Marginal value theorem is an optimality model that describes the foraging behavior of an animal in an environment that is composed of patches with varying degrees of quality scattered around a barren field. To understand, imagine that you are a bear picking apples in a forest. There are some trees with many apples, and there are some trees with very few apples. You waste time traveling between trees and also spend time picking the apples once you're at the tree. You have to decide whether to stay and spend a significant amount of time at the tree you picked or move on to another one. As you stay and pick, the amount of apples on the tree decreases while the amount of time spent picking apples increases. So you have to decide whether to move on to the next tree, not knowing whether you'll find another one or whether you should have stayed. When do you give up?
What's up, Ecology class? My name is Christine Forcillo, and my partner Natalie for Rescue and I are super excited to recap our lecture on sociology. Now, the first thing we need to understand about the relationships in the ecological world is that they are extremely driven by sexual dimorphism, aka the differences in appearance between males and females of the same species due to genetics. Males produce sperm, females produce eggs, and thus they have different levels of gametic investment. Males can easily produce enough sperm to fertilize all of a female's eggs, but not vice versa. Because of this, it's thought that females are a limiting resource that males must compete for. This was solidified by a geneticist named John Bateman in 1948 and is now known as Bateman's principle. Basically, ladies, we're required for males' reproductive success, so don't ever let anybody tell you you're worthless. Ever. Sexual dimorphism provides substantial insight into Darwin's last well-known theory of sexual selection. We all know that Charles Darwin is most well-known for his theory of natural selection. Now, Darwin was sort of puzzled when he realized that in many cases, extravagant traits like an ornate peacock tail are less advantageous to individuals' survival, yet somehow allow for higher rates of reproduction. Thus, the theory of sexual selection was born, and yes, that pun was intentional. Sexual selection can be defined as selection for the development of features that maximize reproductive success, not necessarily survival. So at the end of the day, both natural selection and sexual selection favor whatever traits get more genes into the next generation. This idea is encompassed in a term coined by Darwin called fitness. An organism's fitness is defined by its ability to survive and reproduce. The way I remember it is that animals who are the most fit in populations are the ones that are the most sex successful. Now, if the success of an organism is defined by its ability to reproduce and pass its genes along to its offspring, why don't species just reproduce all the time? The answer is due to the constraints of intrasexual selection versus intersexual selection. These drive competition for mates, mating systems themselves, which Natalie is going to talk about next.
Sex, baby, let's talk about you and me. Let's talk about all the good things and the bad things that may be. Let's talk about sex. All right. Let's talk about sex.
Let's talk about mating systems. Monogamy is when each individual has only one exclusive partner. Polygamy, on the other hand, means the individual mates with more than one partner. If a male mates with more than one female, you have polygyny. If a female mates with more than one male, you have polyandry. Mating systems influence sexual selection. Monogamy guarantees that everyone has the same mating success, whereas varying levels of polygamy means some individuals don't have mates while others have multiple. Polygamy tends to occur when females are clustered together and the offspring require little to no parental care. Polyandry, on the other hand, is favored when males are limited for reproduction. Individuals in a population can vary in how social it is. Not everyone is a social butterfly. Some like to run solo, others will only court a mate and remain solitary otherwise. Some invest as a parent by themselves, others dwell communally in a single cooperative cohabitat, and some overlap adult generations, dividing reproductive labor and cooperating in care for young. Hamilton's rule proposes that selection favors diverting resources to kin when the benefits of doing so outweigh the costs to the helper. This brings us to inclusive fitness. An individual's overall fitness is determined by its own survival and reproduction, as well as those of its relatives. Ultimately, greater relatedness leads to increased altruism.
Species Distributions by Annie, Kate, and Josephine. Species distribution or dispersion is the spatial arrangement of individuals within a population. Patterns of distribution fall into three categories: aggregated or clumped, uniform, and random. Species distribution can be static or can change over time, as in stages of forest succession or for seasonal reproductive trends. Aggregated or clumped distribution is the most common type. Species may congregate around limited resources to avoid predation or to work together to catch their prey. Species may also aggregate temporarily to reproduce or to care for their young. Uniform distribution occurs when the distance between individuals is relatively constant. Species may distribute this way to avoid confrontation or to ration limited resources. Some plants release chemicals that prevent the growth of its species nearby. Others become over-dispersed because their survival increases as their distance from their parent plant increases. This exceptional dance troupe is made up of garden eels, which are found evenly distributed on the ocean floor. Garden eels disperse in this uniform fashion because the portion of their bodies buried in the sand determines how closely they can space themselves. Random distribution generally happens when species occupy a large homogeneous habitat with weak physical gradients, ample resources, low predation, and low competition. This is the least common type of species distribution. In fact, it is so uncommon it might not actually exist. Some ecologists postulate that species that seem to be randomly distributed are just distributed in a way that we do not yet understand. How do ecologists determine species distribution? With math. The picture on the left isn't a kaleidoscope, it's a Voronoi diagram, in which individuals are represented as seeds inside a spherical cell. The cells adjust themselves to the motion of the seeds, covering all potential gaps. The equation on the right is used to determine distribution based on average distance between individuals. Distribution can be influenced by territoriality. A territory is any sociographical area that an individual or species consistently defends. Territoriality can be behavioral, when a specific area is defended intraspecifically, or ecological, when an exclusive area is occupied by only one animal or group. The quality of a territory can also influence breeding habits. When high-quality territories are scarce, some young birds will postpone their own breeding and instead stay and help their parents raise more offspring. This is known as cooperative breeding, and it allows young birds to survive and reproduce more offspring later on. It is also another example of a clump species distribution. Species range, which differs from species territory, refers to the geographical distribution and limitation of a species. Ranges that are either continuous or fragmented in space, and can be persistent with temporal and spatial stability. They can also change seasonally, according to species' reproductive habits and when an invasive species is introduced.
My name is Daniel Habal, and here are the 6 kinds of distribution based on resources, competition, and behavioral interactions. First kind of dispersal is immigration. The distance the animals migrate is usually close to the parent's home range, but varies. This kind of transport is wind transport. Imagine this balloon is a seed. The third kind of dispersal is water transport. Imagine these pieces of tissue are seeds, and just got dispersed by the water. The fourth kind of dispersal is passive navigation. As you can see, This animal is moving according to the direction of the wind, and as the wind changes, so does the direction of the animal. The fifth kind of dispersal is animal vector. As an animal walks around and forages, seeds get stuck to his body and then they just fall off after a while. Sixth and last kind of dispersal is coordinated gamete release, which is self-explanatory.
So now we're going to talk about dispersal and its limitations and how it's linked with genetics. Biological factors such as flight capability are examples of how dispersal can be limited. Studies done with flying insects have demonstrated that those with the capability of flying had lower genetic differentiation than flightless species. This may be due to the fact that flying species have less encounters with each other, while flightless species have increased selection pressures for specializing in their specific habitat, or also an increase in altruism. Human activity can also influence animal dispersal. It can limit dispersal by habitat fragmentation, while it can be increased by transportation. Increased dispersal by humans may introduce invasive species to a new area, which can eventually have a negative effect on its national wildlife. Factors that influence habitat quality, like predation rate, crowding, amount of resources, and climate change, also greatly influence animal dispersal. Natural habitat fragmentation, caused by mountains or rivers, for example, can also lead to speciation, since there is less dispersal and as a result, less gene flow.
So we just spoke a lot about dispersal, but what does real dispersal actually look like? So for a tree, there's a very high density of the seeds right next to the tree, and as you get farther away, the density gets less and less. But if you allow birds to eat the fruit and then transplant the seeds elsewhere, you get a very uniform distribution.
You're wondering now, how do we measure dispersal? So we set up a grid and we do area-based count. And we determine that there's one Boschel bowl per meter squared. So there's one Boschel bowl in every meter squared in the room. So why disperse and how far is enough? So it depends. So an example here, when you have poor habitat quality like a Boschel bowl, you gotta disperse real far, like top of the hub to get better quality food.
What would cause someone to disperse? So we have proximate causes, which are more immediate, like if there was parental aggression, then you would immediately leave and go somewhere else. And there's also, for proximate, innate, that you'd have a migration cue, and once you hear that cue, then you'd go somewhere else. But then we also have ultimate causes, which are much bigger, like competition for resources. You would only leave once you competed with someone for the same resource multiple times, and then you would decide, you know what, there's not enough resources and I'm going to go somewhere else.
There are three different survivorship curves. Type 1 is for case-selected species that have high survival in early and middle life because of high reproductive effort and parental care. There is a rapid decline later in life. Case-selected species include, but are not limited to, humans and large mammals. Type 2 can be used for birds and shows a constant linear mortality rate independent of age. Type 3 is for R-selected species, when mortality rate is highest early in life but is low later on in life after the species has matured and survived the bottleneck effect. The major difference between case-selected and R-selected species is that case-selected species spend a lot more time in a fewer number of offspring. R-selected species invest very little time in their offspring but produce a large amount of them. This can be seen when comparing the two graphs as their curves are almost opposite of one another.
Logistic population growth, where the rate of growth is proportional to both the existing population and the amount of available resources. We discussed logistic growth using the equation dn over dt is equal to r times n times 1 minus n over k, where population size over time is controlled by the carrying capacity k and the intrinsic rate of increase r. N represents density-dependent factors like available space and available food. Remember, k is not a constant value and is instead a range. Oscillations can occur at the carrying capacity as a result of the lag, but there can also be a stable equilibrium state where the population is indefinitely fluctuating around the carrying capacity. The revised equation takes in this delay in time and is dn over dt is equal to r times n times 1 minus n at time t minus the time in the past over k. This relationship is seen between predators and prey as each population's oscillation affects the other.
A good example of this delay can be seen in the relationship between sea urchins and otters.
As sea urchin populations exponentially rise, otter populations rise by similar amounts.
When the sea urchin population crashes, otter populations decline with some lag time. This pattern repeats, causing sea otter and urchin populations to oscillate together.
The Ali effect relates the small population paradigm, SPP, to density dependence, DD. A positive DD occurs when the population of a species is at high density in an area. If a positive DD is associated with an SPP, there is an increase in the reproduction and survival of individuals because there are more mates to choose from in a given area. However, if the population is small and the species are at low density, then there is a decrease in reproductive success because there are fewer mate choices. MVP stands for minimal viable population and is the threshold for SPP. On the graph, you can see that density and proliferation correlate much more in populations nearing or below the MVP, showing that smaller populations are more sensitive to density than larger populations. We discussed humans as an example of exponential growth. Under optimal conditions of unlimited space, unlimited access to food, birth rate is high and death rate is low. The human population took 200,000 years to reach 1 billion and only 200 years to reach 7 billion.
Hey everyone, I'm Yehan.
And I'm Tiffany.
And I'm Elias.
Today's lesson is on life history. What is life history? Life history is a series of adaptations that are related to an organism's biology. Some examples of biology that are influenced are growth and development, reproduction, and survival. Each of these has a variety of traits that are often involved in trade-offs. Almost all organisms have some measure of these traits.
Life history vital rates. So this equation below explains the relationship among the different variables that factor into the generation time of a population of organisms. You can see the different terms of the equation and what they represent below. This equation is the basis for the Weinmiller and Rose classification system. The Weinmiller and Rose classification system groups organisms into three main groups: opportunistic, equilibrium, and periodic. These groups are based on the different criteria of survivorship, which is LX, fecundity, which is MX, and age of maturity. There are characteristics of three different groups. First one is opportunistic, which has low juvenile survival, low fecundity, and early maturity. Overall, they maximize colonization ability in unstable environments. Periodic organisms also have low juvenile survival, but have high fecundity and late maturity, and they maximize infrequent favorable conditions. And the last one is equilibrium, which have high juvenile survival, low fecundity, and late maturity.
Another classification system for life histories are the K and R selection. The concept of R-selected versus K-selected growth come from logistic model of population growth. The traits of R-selected species are early maturity, a large clutch size, small parental investment, and a short generation time. These traits maximize reproduction and rapid growth rates. These are some examples of the R-selected species, as you can see here. We have like dandelions, mice, mosquitoes, and frogs. The R-selected species are found in unstable, temporary, and frequently disturbed habitats. K-selected species show traits of delayed maturity, small clutch size, high parental investment, and a long generation times. These traits maximize competitive success in a crowded condition. These are some examples of the K-selected species. We as humans are K-selected species. Humpback whales, cranes, and even dogs. K-selected species are found in stable, predictable, and rarely disturbed habitats.
Trade-offs. Trade-offs are illustrated by the principle of allocation, which explains the distribution of energy. If an organism allocates energy to one function, such as growth or reproduction, it reduces the amount of energy available to other functions, such as defense. An example of trade-off is number versus size of offsprings. Plants that produce smaller seeds have larger number of offsprings, and vice versa. This also applies to animals, where larger sized offsprings are fewer in number and smaller sized offsprings are larger in number. Another example of trade-off is growth versus reproduction. Early maturity is accompanied by slowdown or stopping growth. Early age of first reproduction is associated with fast-growing populations, and lifetime reproduction may be maximized by delaying first reproduction if early survival is more probable. All of these life history properties respond to natural selection.
Thank you for listening to our 3-minute summary about life history. We hope you learned something and hope you have a great day.
Competition is a really big thing in nature. There's a lot of species in nature and a limited amount of stuff, like space or food, to go around. So competition has a huge influence on species distribution and evolution. There are a couple types of competition. Interference competition is direct, antagonistic, and aggressive, like two tigers fighting over food, or two guys from Boston fighting over a seat on the tee. Preemptive competition is direct, but only because one species settled first, like coral settling prime spots on the reef, or someone snagging a seat on the tee. Exploitation competition is indirect and occurs when one species is a hogger of common resource. Think trees competing for sunlight, or people competing for space on the tee. Man, the tee is a pretty competitive place. Apparent competition is indirect and occurs when an increase in one prey species leads to a decrease in another prey species due to positive response by a common predator. So if lions eat both warthog and wildebeest, an increase in warthogs can lead to a decrease in wildebeest because there are now more lions, which is fine because wildebeest scarred my childhood. On a larger scale, competition can be divided into intra- and interspecific competition. Intraspecific competition is how a population can be self-regulated through exploitation, which is competition for a shared resource like the limited number of fries at the dining hall, and interference, direct competition for resources like mates, aka Tinder. Interspecific competition is between two species. To figure out how each species affects the other, we have to turn to these guys, two mathematicians who had the same twist on the traditional logistic growth equation and very different facial hair. According to the Lotka-Volterra this model, which is this equation, this is the change in population of species 1 over the change in time, this is the max growth rate, n1 is the number of species 1, k1 is the carrying capacity of species 1, alpha is the competition coefficient, which shows how many of species 2 is equivalent to one member of species 1, and n2 is the number of species 2. The same equation for species 2 looks like this. From this, there are 4 possible outcomes. Species 1 wins, species 2 wins, coexistence occurs, or one species wins depending on starting conditions. Put another way, when species A, in this case unicorns, wins, we get this graph with the unicorns on this line and the centaurs on this line, because unicorns outcompete the centaurs and eat all the grass. When species B, centaurs, wins, we get this graph with the unicorns on this line and the centaurs on this line, because centaurs outcompete the unicorns and eat all the grass. Coexistence is when intraspecific competition is greater than interspecific competition, so we get this graph because each species is so busy fighting amongst themselves that there are not enough centaurs left to overpower the unicorns and vice versa. Density-dependent or unstable equilibrium is when the species could converge to an equilibrium but are then pushed out of equilibrium by their starting density. In the case of centaurs and unicorns, the graph would look like this. If centaurs have a higher abundance than the equilibrium point, they will win. But if unicorns have a higher abundance than the equilibrium point, they will win. Ultimately, the only way out of competition is niche specialization.
Predation. Wheel of interactions. Mutualism describes the interaction between two species that have no effect on each other. A mutualistic relationship is one in which two species benefit from interacting with each other. If the species cannot survive without each other, the relationship is obligate mutualism. If the species benefit from interaction with each other, but don't need the other to survive, the relationship is facultative. Competition describes a relationship between species in which the fitness of one is lowered via the interaction with the other. Synechrosis is a rare form of symbiosis in which the interaction between two species is mutually lethal. Commensalism is when one species benefits from interacting with another species that remains neutral. Conversely, amensalism is when the fitness of one species is lowered by interacting with another species that remains neutral. Predation and parasitism is when one species benefits via interacting with the other and the other species is harmed. Predation models are made for the predator population and the prey population, starting with a logistic growth curve that shows how population expansion decreases as resources become scarce and levels off when the carrying capacity of the environment is reached. This can be seen in the logistic curve graph and the logistic curve equation. The prey population never reaches carrying capacity due to the negative effect of predation, therefore the end of the part of the equation is not necessary. Three main factors affect the prey population model: predator density, prey density, and capture efficiency. The prey population growth is equal to the exponential growth minus the number lost to predators, shown in this equation. The population growth rate of predators depends on rates of conversion and assimilation of prey into reproduction. It's also necessary to include predator mortality, which depends on the population size and the mortality rate. The overall predator population growth is equal to the birth rate minus the mortality rate. Assumptions of these models follow the assumptions for any Locke-Volterra model. Number 1, the prey will grow exponentially if the predator is absent. Number 2, the predator will starve without the prey. Number 3, the predator can consume infinite amount of prey. And number 4, this doesn't include immigration or emigration. Using the model, prey are at equilibrium when the equation is equal to 0. Therefore, when you solve for 0, you get p hat equals r divided by a, which shows the value of predators for which prey population is stable. This is a not very long, unstable equilibrium, and will not happen either because of either loss of prey or the predator keeps eating. The predators are shown at equilibrium when n hat equals m over ba, which shows the number of prey that keep predator population stable and is also an unstable equilibrium. When you combine the two graphs, you get the Locke-Volterra predation analysis, which shows that there is no predator-prey stable equilibrium biologically. A single birth or a single death of a predator or prey will end up on the circle. So this is the final graph.